Well, good afternoon, everyone, and welcome to the virtual Sigur Center for Asian Studies at the Elliott School of International Affairs at George Washington University. I'm Professor David Shambaugh. Um, I'm former director of the Sigur Center and still director of the China Policy Program here at GW, and it's my pleasure to moderate today's event on Southeast Asia and the future of the rule-based liberal international order. First, let me just note that this is on the record. So if any of the journalists present wish to use the material, you should know that. You're free to do so. And it's a personal pleasure, I must say, to welcome and introduce our speaker today, Professor Benjamin Ho, from the Rajaratnam School of International Studies at Nanyang Technological University in Singapore. I first met Benjamin actually 5 years ago, I guess it was, 2017, when I was a visiting scholar, not a Fulbright, but a visiting scholar on sabbatical at RSIS in Singapore. So here we are 5 years later, and we've been delighted to have Benjamin with us for the past several months here in Washington as a Fulbright scholar. He won a very competitive senior Fulbright fellowship to come here during COVID, and has been researching the topic he's going to speak about today. So this is in some ways a readout on what he's learned during his period here in Washington. It's a personal pleasure to welcome you, Benjamin. Let me just tell our audience a little bit about you first. Benjamin is currently an assistant professor at RSIS, which, by the way, is the Elliott School's institutional partner in Singapore, a really valued partner, I must say. We've had wonderful numbers of exchanges that both I and Benjamin and our students have benefited from. But he's an assistant professor there in the China program and also works a lot on regional security. His special area of expertise is Chinese foreign policy. And I must commend all of you. His recently published book, very significant work, titled China's Political Worldview and Chinese Exceptionalism. There, for those of you who are interested in it, it's a superb study, really. I've read it cover to cover myself and can highly recommend it. And as someone who's worked his whole career in Chinese perceptions, I learned a great deal. So Benjamin got his doctorate from the LSE in London, following his bachelor's degree from Nanyang Technological University in Singapore. And he's really very broad gauged in his interests and his research. He's just starting his career. He's truly already, I would say, a rising star in Southeast Asia, in China studies and in international relations studies in Southeast Asia. So you all will be hearing and seeing and reading more from him for many, many years to come. And it's just been a pleasure to have you with us for the past few months, Benjamin. I'm really sorry that the period is coming to an end in a week or two, and you have to return to Singapore just as spring is coming here in Washington, D.C. But Benjamin's going to speak for about 25, 30 minutes, and he has some slides to accompany his presentation. And then I will moderate the last half hour of discussion and question and answer. If you have questions, please type them into the chat. We have someone monitoring the chat. I will also try and monitor it myself, and we will select questions from there. So if you have a question, please put it into the chat function. Okay, with no further ado, Benjamin, welcome, and so over to you.
Thank you, Professor Shambaugh, for your very kind remarks. I'm just waiting for the slides to be loaded. Okay, thank you so much. So as Professor Shambaugh highlighted, I've been spending the last 3 months here in Washington, D.C., conducting research on this topic on Southeast Asia and the future of the rules-based liberal international order. So what I will do essentially for today is to sort of, it's certainly not an exhaustive discussion on this topic. I'm just getting started, but I thought I would like to lay out, at least to the audience here, some of the observations and insights that I've obtained in the past 3 months. Please forgive me if this presentation does not sound very scholarly with the sort of literature review and methodology and things like that, because this, I would say this presentation is more on a piece of reflection and the opportunity to reflect on what I've done and how this fit into this broader topic. So with that, let's move on to the outline of what I'm going to do. So what I'm going to do in today's presentation is to first talk about this project. Why is it important? The significance of it, and what, and more broadly in terms of policy, I guess, if some of us are interested, how does that relate with regards to American view in Southeast Asia? And then I'll talk about what I did in this project, some of the key questions that have guided my research and interviews. And then I'll touch on the topic on Southeast Asia as a theater of great power competition. I'm very aware, this is a field that Professor Shambaugh is eminently qualified. So I'll just talk about some of the observations and insights that I have, and we certainly could have further time for Q&A. And then I'll go into something a little more academic, but I thought, but given that this reflects the core of what I'm doing, I think it's important to sort of highlight some preliminary ideas I have with regards to this concept of a rules-based order. And then finally, I'll talk some of my personal reflections of my time in the United States, as well as how this period allowed me to make better sense of what's happening in the US. And I'll conclude with some brief remarks. Next slide, please, Rebecca. So this is my project, and these are the 3 questions that have guided my time in the United States conducting research into this idea of a rules-based order and Southeast Asia. The first question that I raised in this project is the whole idea of what do American political scholars understand by the term rules-based order? And I highlight this. This is interesting because if you just watch the news, Secretary of State Antony Blinken just mentioned this term again in his meeting, I believe in Australia. So this concept of rules-based order certainly has a lot of policy sort of, it has of policy mention. Whatever we believe about it, the fact is that this term is out there. It's been used by policymakers, and not just in America, but but so too in Southeast Asia. Many Southeast Asian leaders have made mention of this term. So if you just take a very cursory search on Google, this concept of rules-based order is out there in public domain. So I'm interested to know, what do American political scholars understand? And more importantly, how are these rules determined, and what are the characteristics of such an order? A second question would be, and this really relates to Sino-US competition, to what extent does China's rise represent a systemic challenge to the rules-based liberal international order, and why? And last but not least, the third question I had is, how do American scholars view Southeast Asia countries as sort of free riding on American security presence in Asia, while being, for lack of a better term, or to use a more vivid term, comfortably in bed with China? And how does this affect the future of US Southeast Asia relations? So these are 3 broad questions I had. Certainly, the interviews that I had, both online and offline with the respondents in DC, have been very rich, and to the extent that in my subsequent slides, we'll be able to capture just part of the gist of it. But I hope to expand subsequently on this research into a much more, into a bigger write-up, which I do hope to publish at some point. So with these 3 questions in mind, let's just take a look at some of my findings. Next slide. Next slide, please, Rebecca. All right. Before I move on, I'm sure this map is not foreign to us. I'm just sort of sketching out the terrain of Southeast Asia. But it must be said, and this is quite important, that Southeast Asia, if you just take a plane across Southeast Asia, it's certainly, in terms of geography, you could basically travel from Beijing to any of these countries in 6 hours. I think the furthest is probably Indonesia. If you take a flight from Washington, D.C. Westwards, in 6 hours, you'll be at San Francisco. So I guess it really goes, what this highlights is really the fact that geography means a lot when it comes to understanding great power dynamics in Southeast Asia. The very fact that China is a 6-hour flight from anywhere in Southeast Asia certainly gives Beijing much more advantage in that sense in Southeast Asia, in terms of its diplomatic abilities compared to the United States. Okay, let's just move on to the next slide now. So this is just a sketch on the geographical terrain of Southeast Asia. I'll talk now briefly about Southeast Asia as a theater of great power competition. And in this case, I like to build upon Professor Shambaugh's very excellent work on where great powers meet, where he has done a lot of research on Southeast Asia, various relationships with both great powers. But what I did basically in this 3 months here is to ask this main question. And this is one key question, especially policymakers that might be quite relevant. How do American scholars view Southeast Asia countries as free riding on America's security presence in Asia while also being in bed with China? And how does this affect the future of US Southeast Asia relations? And these are some of the if we were to group the answers into the spectrum, these would be 4 broad categories that I would sort of categorize the answers. Some scholars say it's no problem. I recall one of them said, as an American, obviously, if you're speaking as an American patriot, as American policymakers, it's very natural that you would prefer Southeast Asia on our side. So that's perfectly understandable. But I would do exactly the same if I was from Southeast Asia. So basically, while it is understood and accepted that as an American, you would want countries in Southeast Asia on your side, but if you are talking from Southeast Asia, it's the fact that Southeast Asia countries sort of hedge and sort of play both the United States and China is also perfectly understandable. We may disagree with it, but that seems to be from a very realistic appraisal of and cynical or perhaps clinical appraisal of Southeast Asia countries' interests. That is exactly what Southeast Asia countries would do, or at least what the response was. If you were from Southeast Asia, you would do exactly what they would do. There's also an acknowledgement from some people whom I spoke to that Southeast Asia countries are more savvy than we thought. And the key concern that was raised is the whole issue of American reliability. If you were from Southeast Asia, are you going to put all your fruits, all your eggs in one basket? And the answer would be no. It makes sense to sort of diversify. It makes sense to sort of work with both the United States and China, and even one might say other regional powers such as Japan, Australia, and India. So it sort of reflects some kind of calculus on Southeast Asia policymaker part that so long we acknowledge, we appreciate America's security presence in the region, but we're not going to sort of blindly align ourselves with America's security preferences in our region. The second point that I gathered from some of my interviews is the fact that America's interest in Southeast Asia is, and I use the term generally, a derivative of its broader concerns towards China. So in other words, America is primarily interested in Southeast Asia, not because of anything inherently attractive about Southeast Asia per se, but because right now, at least, it is framed by its geopolitical competition with China. So that's something that got me thinking about the extent to which American policymakers have sort of framed its Southeast Asian policies as very much tied to its geopolitical competition with China, and that's perfectly understandable given China's rise, China's challenge, and even some would say the threat of China. But the point is that framing America's interest in Southeast Asia policies as a derivative of its broader concerns towards China creates all sorts of other very problematic issues. Because if you were policymakers from Southeast Asia, you would ask, okay, so what if one day United States and what if one day this relationship were to completely fracture? Or what then it is for Southeast Asia? Is America going to walk away? Or if the relationship becomes very well, is it going to be a case of a G2 condominium and sort of Southeast Asia countries become relegated to the sideshow? So that's something to keep in mind. The third observation is that, and this again, among some scholars and even policymakers I spoke to, is that Southeast Asia has increasingly become irrelevant as the US develops other multilateral alliances such as AUKUS and Quad. And this is certainly something that I guess if you speak to people who are impatient with the state of relationship with what is happening in Southeast Asia, for instance, the ongoing impasse over Myanmar has created all sorts of intramural issues and complexities within Southeast Asia. So I'm not surprised if there are people in Washington who feel that, hey, if we look at our real interest, it is really with other multilateral alliances such as AUKUS and Quad. And certainly we are seeing a lot of such outreaches in the past few months by American policymakers. Even now, as we're speaking, there is this Quad foreign ministers meeting going on right now. The last point, and then I'll move on to the next section on the rules-based order, is that there are some scholars and some people I spoke to who continue to exhibit strong confidence that US values are more imitable to Southeast Asia countries than those of China. And this really goes back to one very key sort of attraction of the United States compared to China, and that is its values, its way of life. Someone said that, well, Southeast Asia, if you ask policymakers in Southeast Asia, where would they want to send their children to for graduate study, most of them would say it's the United States. So in that sense, United States continue to sort of have great attraction to Southeast Asia. The Fulbright scholarship is one such example of some kind of inherent value of the United States to the region. So with these four broad points in mind, I'll go on to my next segment on how does a rules-based order factor into all this. Next slide, Rebecca. So this might seem a bit academic, but I thought this is a good time to sort of lay out some of my preliminary thoughts. And I have to say, some of these thoughts only occurred when I made a road trip in the United States. So I didn't think about these ideas, but while driving, and the good thing about United States is that it's a huge country. So I had opportunity to basically drive on the interstate highways and with my family on our road trips. And during those moments when my kids are asleep in the car, it was a great opportunity to sort of think about the rules-based order. And I want to use this analogy of traffic rules as a way to think about rules-based order. If you notice these two pictures, so the picture on the left, it's sort of, I got it from Google, a typical interstate I-95 traffic, peak hour traffic. The picture on the right is sort of traffic in one of the capital cities in Southeast Asia. And it really got me thinking about the rules of the road and how these rules reflect the idea of a rules-based order. Let me move on to the next slide and I will try and explain what I mean. So it's interesting. In my driving experiences in the United States, I had two brief observations. One is that, well, as someone who is new to driving in the United States, most of the time I was keeping on the right side of the road where it's the slowest. So, and it's fascinating because in the course of my road trips to the New York City and to Buffalo, notwithstanding the fact that I was probably the slowest driver on the interstate highway, none of the vehicles behind actually flashed their high beam at me or attempted to sort of honk their at me. And it got me thinking, because in countries, and even in my own country, if you're driving too slow, most of the time you'll be flashed, someone will flash the beam at you. What they do here, however, is they will sort of overtake you and then sort of go back. Again, my sample size is very limited, and I don't pretend to know all the idiosyncrasies of American driving culture, but it sort of gives me an understanding that no matter how slow you drive, okay, I wasn't driving that slow, but certainly slow enough to be overtaken by many other bigger vehicles, there is sort of a tacit understanding that you would just overtake and there are rules on the road and you sort of filter back. The second instance, and this is interesting, and again, I must admit that this does not mean in any terms that I think American drivers, that the rules on American roads are always the best, but I found this very interesting. On one trip, specifically on the way back on the I-95, there was a huge traffic jam. I can assure you, in many countries in Southeast Asia, including my own, whenever there is a traffic jam, many cars will attempt to overtake others by going on the road shoulder. But I was very fascinated by the fact that there was no vehicles on the road shoulder attempting to sort of move up the queue illegally. Well, I don't know whether it's because of the fact that there are cameras and you can get fined. I mean, in many countries, there are also rules prohibiting such behavior. But in America, it's fascinating. All the cars were sort of queuing up and following. And to the extent that I did not feel good if I had to overtake the car in front of me. So that got me thinking about the rules of the road. And if we compare a rules-based order to rules on the road or traffic rules, one could say that they are broadly universal. So regardless of whether you drive in Singapore, you drive in China, you drive in Thailand, you drive in the United States, there are broad rules that all drivers would understand. And in this case, I found driving in the United States generally pleasant one, generally a pleasant one. However, we need to also recognize there is a need to account for specific and situational peculiarities. So depending on which country you go, it is not to say there are no rules in roads in Southeast Asia. Not to say that the rules in the United States are perfectly sort of framed or perfectly being put forth. However, there are indeed specific and situational differences that we need to account for. So as such, with that in mind, I just sort of want to highlight what I understand about rules-based order. And I'll try and relate these things to my own interest in Southeast Asia. The first would be rules of enforcement. And this really goes to the heart of what I mean by rules. If you're not able to enforce these rules, are they considered rules? Can they be enforced? However, one could also raise the question, in the absence of 100% enforcement, in other words, can all the rules be enforced all the time? From my own experience driving in the United States, certainly not the case. Although there are rules, it's impossible for the police to enforce these rules, all the time. So in other words, there seems to be some kind of habits of the heart, some kind of unspoken logic or rules in place where drivers sort of know what to do, even in the absence of explicit enforcement. So this is something we need to take into account. Can these rules be enforced? In some countries, you need very strong surveillance to enforce these rules. And that raises the issue of whether such instances of enforcement, are they sustainable? So I was very intrigued by my time in America, at least on the roads, that there seemed to be very little enforcement, and yet cars generally, again, this is a very limited sample size, and I'm sure we have friends here who may disagree with me, but in general, in the countryside, especially on highway driving, people tend to be quite courteous. Okay, so I'll put this on the record. You can quote me in there. That was my experience. The second point is that of rules of enablement. So if it's all about enforcing, then it's going to be a problem, because rules not only ought to allow enforcement, rules also ought to enable. And some of the questions that I hope that I've been asking is, how do these rules enable social flourishing and activity to take place? Do they enable more than they disable? And I think this is important, because when we talk about the rules of global order, the question must be asked, what are these rules, and do they enable countries to interact more? Do they enable trade to flourish? Do they enable people to sort of travel freely, to free access to information, things like that? So we need, in other words, a very expansive view of political life, or are we talking about a more restrictive one? So this is something that we should talk about when we discuss a rules-based order. And what are the trade-offs that need to be made? And are they acceptable to both to the ruler and those being ruled? The third point, and this might probably be more relevant to some of what we see out there, the rules of engagement. How do actors relate and interact with one another under such conditions? Do these rules facilitate greater interaction, including imposing costs to bad behavior and conferring benefits to good behavior? And what mechanisms are there to arbitrate the rules in the event of disagreement and conflict? And this is certainly the case for international politics, both in the region and globally. Let's move on to the next slide. So some personal reflections, and this is really more on my own reflection on American political life, less so on China, though I'll just touch a bit on China towards the end. Some reflections, and that is America's foreign policy and international politics is very much deeply shaded by its own sense of idealism and a very liberal political culture. That's one key takeaway I got in my 3 months in the United States. A very strong sense of idealism and also a very liberal political culture. The second point, and that is about the idea of liberal democracy. It is viewed as an inherently good thing, even though it can be messy. And this is what one of the my respondents said. We prefer to live free and messy than to have one's freedom curtailed and constrained. And this is very much played out in the COVID experience. Coming from Singapore, where at the time of departure, we were not allowed to have more than 2 people eating outside, to America, we could when we could eat as a family, 6 of us. That was a very, very interesting sort of experience. And of course, we have got people agreeing or disagreeing about whether people should wear masks, but it really reflects the kind of very inherent proclivity in Americans about not having their freedoms being taken away, be it for health reasons or be it for religious or other reasons. And therefore lies the China challenge and threat. It stems primarily from 3 main sources. I don't have time to go all 3, but we can discuss during the Q&A. First is the idea of regime type. The fact that it is a communist country led by a communist party is viewed as something problematic. Communism is inherently bad. I get that. I get a sensing that there is always that fear and threat of communism. Of course, one might ask the question, but America is willing to work with other communist states, most obviously like Vietnam. Well, I suppose one could say Vietnam is a communist country, but it is small, whereas China is a communist country and it's big. So therein lies that threat. But I think regardless of whether it's small or big, I think there seems to be some kind of residual suspicion towards the communist worldview and its way of life. And that is really played out in how the United States US-China competition in recent years. And this links me to the second point, which is a clash of worldviews and a very fundamental incompatibility between liberal democracy and a Marxist-Leninist political structure, because the latter is essentially about control, whereas liberal democracy is very much about promoting the kinds of freedoms. The third point, and this is what I also gather, is that the China challenge stems from the fact that China wants to erode American influence and challenge America's interests in the Indo-Pacific. So let's move on to my final point about the disagreement. And in my view, and this is interesting because people do ask that question, well, rules, aren't they always made by actors, institutions who serve some purpose? However, I would argue that rules also reflect a certain normative preference of order, which in turn suggests a particular conception of what is good of good order ought to entail. In other words, when you talk about order, there is a normative conception of what a good order ought to be like. And therefore, this whole idea of a good is a very contested concept right now. The issue of whose rules and who rules is not likely to find satisfactory agreement. So, however, rather than label these rules as Western or non-Western, and therefore we should embrace or reject them outrightly, what I argue is that we ought to interrogate the content of these rules and to examine what these rules tell us about the nature of society that they represent. So in other words, if we talk about what these rules are supposed to represent and what is good about the kinds of society that they serve, we run up against the question of how does China and the United States define what is good? In my view, and this might be quite simplistic, is that what is good for the US is generally good for the world, including China. So I get this from the whole idea of how America views its interests, that what is good for us, it's generally good for the world. Not all the time, not to everybody, but generally good for the world. I quote Rainer Niebuhr in his book written some 70 years ago. We were, of course, not immune to the temptation believing that the universal validity of what we held in trust justified our use of power to establish it. But nonetheless, I think there is a very broad consensus is that what is good for America is generally good for the average man in Korea, the average man in Japan, in Singapore, even in China. However, this is a bit different from the Chinese experience. It takes a much more party-centric, narrow view of what is good. In other words, what is good for the CCP is good for China, but what is good for the US may not be what is good for the world. And by extension, what is good for China, it really doesn't matter what the average man in Korea, in Japan, in Singapore, in Thailand thinks. Because, and this is where one might argue that China seeks to cultivate political elites because these are the people who ultimately make decisions, and less so on with regards to the average person. And finally, on conclusion, let's go to my concluding slides. All right, so in conclusion, I would argue that there is right now a contestation over the rules of the road, and it will be one of the key determinants of the outcome of great power competition. And certainly it will affect Southeast Asia. What kinds of rules are going to what are the rules in the future global order? Are they going to be just purely rules of enforcement, or are they at the same time able to enable activity? And what about the rules of engagement? So I would argue that this contestation over the rules will be one of the key factors of the outcome of great power competition. And those who abide by these rules are likely to have the moral high ground in global affairs. Conversely, those who break the rules are likely to be negatively perceived. And this brings me to my second last point: is the current liberal international system sufficiently equitable or universal? Is there a better alternative? And if so, what would be the characteristics of such an order, bearing in mind the need to balance out the rules of enforcement, rules of enablement, and rules of engagement? And finally, and this really is about America political life, can the US reclaim a vision of a common good? In my 3 months in US, I've come to see some of the divisions in the United States, and I'm sure that is played out every day in the news. And this really raises the question: is what the United States government promoting right now something of a common good generally to countries in the world, or is it about playing up to very specific partisan interests? And those are big questions that are being asked by policymakers in Southeast Asia. So one that has a very broad and not narrowly defined view of the world. Finally, I'd like to convey on record my appreciation to the following. Next slide, please. So I'd like to thank the Fulbright Commission for making this research stint possible, and for their very generous support. Certainly the Sigur Center and the Elliott School for their hospitality, help, and friendship. Miriam and Rebecca, both who have been fantastic in both the my pre-Fulbright preparations and my time here. And certainly Professor David Shambaugh and Professor Bob Sutter for their helpful insights. And of course, all the interviewees I had the opportunity to speak with in person, new friends we made in Capitol Hill Baptist Church that we attended in the course of this 3 months. And of course, my home institution, RSIS, for granting me this 3 months sabbatical. And last but not least, and very importantly, my family, wife, and kids for keeping me grounded in daily reality and to thoroughly enjoy this time in the United States with them. With that, I've come to the end of my presentation, and to show that I actually made those road trips, the last slide will be proof of my presence in the Niagara Falls and in New York City with my family. Thank you so much for your time. Sorry, I exceeded by a few minutes. Pass the time to Professor Shambaugh.
Wonderful, Benjamin. Great to see you and your family at Niagara Falls, and thank you very much for your presentation. And I'm just really struck by your traffic metaphor and rules of the road, quite literally. I can see a great potential comparative research project. You're going to have to go driving, I think, in many different countries in order to complete this project over time. But the relationship between driving and political culture of a country and international relations, and I suggest that you maybe include India in your in your driving experiences. But it's a really interesting metaphor, and I must say, from a Fulbright perspective, but also from an American academic perspective, we really want our visiting scholars to get out into American society, not just to sit in the library in their offices doing their research projects, but to really experience American society, all dimensions of it, and to go home with a fuller appreciation and understanding of the United States. But to marry together what you just did, American society and driving, with your research, that's a really intriguing idea. And, it gets to the question of conditioned behavior and norms, why people um, obey, and what is the basis of obedience? I would submit that at least, and there's a lot of research that's been done on this in sociology, psychology, political science. Oh, it has a lot to do with respect, number one, and legitimacy, perception of legitimacy. Not just deterrence, or, is the speed camera going to catch me or not? That's not the reason people don't speed. There's a deeper sense of legitimacy, perception of legitimacy of the system and the rules and the norms and the order that underlies it. So anyway, glad to see you were out on the highway. I was a little worried about you because, you come from a country where you drive on the right, and both in the car and on the road. And I was thinking, oh boy, he's going to drive on I-95. That's hard enough, but he's got to adjust himself to the other side of the road. Anyway, glad to see you made it without any accidents. Listen, while the questions are going into the chat, please, I'd like to encourage everybody to do that. I'll take the proverbial power of the chair to ask the first one, and it kind of grows out of your your traffic metaphor and the competitive rules, the competitive orders, you might say, that the United States and China represent. There's a lot of writing going on in the Chinese foreign policy field anyway, not in China, but outside of China, about this. Does China really have an alternative system that it's making available to or imposing upon the world, or is it a more piecemeal, ad hoc kind of approach? There's a lot of debate in the field on this subject, but I'd like to bring the question to Southeast Asia and to particularly the question of soft power. If you could talk a little bit about how Southeast Asians, mind you, there are 11 countries, it's very hard to generalize. That's the first lesson I learned in my own research in Southeast Asia. You cannot generalize about Southeast Asia. But to the extent one can, if China's going to have a kind of order impact, a normative impact on the region, that would assume that the region respects China, sees legitimacy in the Chinese regime, and buys into the kinds of norms that the Chinese government seeks to advocate and export, and the degree to which their norms intersect with ASEAN norms, right? So could you just talk a little bit about the sort of soft power dimension of China's appeal in Southeast Asia as you see it, and how legitimate Southeast Asians see Chinese norms as being?
Well, thanks, Professor Shambaugh. I'll just touch briefly on soft power and also the norms in ASEAN. I think there has been, in the start of the 21st century, following Joseph Nye's publication of soft power, I think many Chinese scholars started getting very wedded to the idea of soft power and started sort of exploring what kind of soft power does China have. Of course, we're all very familiar with iterations of Confucius institutes and stuff like that. But by and large, I think, at least in Southeast Asia, the Chinese have always felt that Chinese culture, broadly defined, represents a conduit and it's a source of soft power. So in that sense, it is very much about exporting that kind of Chinese culture and what it means, and trying to really play up this peaceful aspect of Chinese rise. If we understand and try to sort of put aside the sort of hard power that challenges the dimensions of Chinese soft power. If you relate that to Southeast Asia, I would say one very strong normative tie that China has with Southeast Asia is that idea of non-interference. It's a norm that is very much enshrined in ASEAN, that countries should not interfere in the business of other countries. Many ASEAN scholars, including myself, have sort of argued against the weaknesses of such a norm. But nonetheless, I think it is still very much entrenched as a value, so to speak, among Southeast Asian policymakers, that that as smaller countries, obviously we can understand why they don't want bigger countries to interfere. But at the same time, one should also recognize it is about sending signals to Southeast Asian neighbors, that means our neighbors, that they ought not to sort of interfere. So that policy has sort of allowed China to grab the moral high ground in a sense to say that, okay, we're not going to interfere in your elections. Of course, in reality, there are always some kind of interference going on. But in terms of, I think what they probably mean is that we're not going to teach you how to run your country. We're not going to teach you whether we're not going to scold you if human rights issues are being violated, and that, in a sense, fits very, very well. Certainly not to all Southeast Asia countries, but to some Southeast Asia countries. And why do I say that? Because we need to recognize Southeast Asia is not a monolithic lot. You have got different political regimes. You've got communist countries, you've got socialists, you've got democracies, you've got authoritarian regimes. So it's a very much, and I think the bottom line that Southeast Asia leaders sort of agree on is that we will not instruct our neighbors how to behave. And in that sense, China is quite happy because it knows that it is able to get what it wants from Southeast Asia simply because it does not instruct them in terms of its political regime, except for sort of hinting that you should support our preferences. But that's not the same as regime change per se. So I think that's where the Chinese sort of use that as an advantage it has over the United States.
Great, thank you, Benjamin. So we have a number of questions in the queue, quite interesting ones. Excuse me, I was just looking. So I'm going to start with, there's one, by the way, asking you to compare driving in China. I don't know if you've ever done that. I wouldn't advise it myself, having done it, at least outside the cities. There is a very good book for that person who asked this question called, I think it's called Driving China, by Gifford, the current National Public Radio correspondent in London.
Okay.
Anyway, I'm going to skip that question, but there's one from one of my students, current students, who comes from China, Sheldon Xie. He's an MA Asian Studies student here at the Elliott School, and he asks, according to Asian IR constructivist theorist David Kong, which shows me that he's been doing the reading for our course, the alternative international order in Asia would be Confucianism-based and articulate a revival of Confucian regional and global order led by China. How do you view this articulation? Is it possible for a China-led order in Asia on the basis of Confucianism to emerge as a framework for a peaceful rise?
Thank you so much. I've read David Kang's book, and it's a very fascinating argument simply because it sets forth his premise so clearly. However, I have problems with this idea of a Confucian-led order. And it's interesting, I was just having lunch with a Korean friend earlier, and we were just talking about what about a Confucian-led order? And his answer was very straightforward. There is no one Confucian-led order. And even if we assume that the Confucian-led order is the order that has sort of been, that is permanent, that is similar to what was that in the past in pre-modern times, the fact is that countries like Japan, Korea, and China view the idea of Confucian very differently. So to say that this is a Confucian-led order, assuming this order is monolithic and homogeneous across our countries, would be really to overstate the variety in which Confucianism interacts with reality on the ground. At the same time, one might also make the argument: what exactly does a Confucian-led Chinese order means to other countries in East Asia or even Northeast Asia? If you just want to isolate the region, it is very unclear. We don't see the Japanese talking about a Confucian-led order in its international relations. We don't hear a lot about Korean discussing its preference for Confucian-led order. If any, it's always a rules-based order that is being used. So I would say a Confucian-led order is interesting, but it is very unclear what that order means and whether that order is indeed the same order we are talking about in pre-modern times, assuming that all three countries or the countries in the region actually sort of had a similar order governing their societies during that period.
Very good response. Thank you very much. So the next one comes from Peter Fowler, who asks, first, he says, thank you very much for your presentation. In your opinion, do the current and evolving economic reliance and increasing dependency of Southeast Asian countries on trade with China, as well as the expanding military dominance of China in the region, lead to having those pro-Western ASEAN nations feeling intimidated by China from taking more explicit steps to ally themselves with the West in trade and security spheres? Sort of follows on to the previous question, but slightly different.
Okay, I'll just answer the last part. I do not think Southeast Asian countries will explicitly ally themselves with the United States or with the West. There's always some level of implicit and sort of hidden alliances. So it's not going to be explicit. They're not going to say we're going to ally ourselves entirely with the West, be it in joining a sort of a Quad Plus or even sort of wanting to be to explicitly talk about their preference for the United States. However, I would also want to caution that this idea that its economic reliance on China is not necessarily something always the case. We are all aware. I've just read a book that Professor Shambaugh passed me on America's presence in Singapore, but certainly more broadly in Southeast Asia. And you can see United States has a lot invested in the region. It doesn't talk a lot about it, but it has a lot. And to the extent that countries in the region are aware of America's presence, America's very deep investments, military presence in the region, I think it's a case of, well, they probably don't want to say it, but it's not a bad deal for them. So certainly in terms of certain things like tourist numbers, well, it's obvious. It takes less than 6 hours for Chinese tourists to travel to any Southeast Asian capital. For an American to travel to Southeast Asia, it's going to be much, much more. So in that sense, one could say that China has certain advantages simply because of its geography. We talk about trade, perhaps in terms of trade, perishables like fruits, vegetables. Certainly we see more Chinese vegetables on the market than say broccoli from California. But the point that I want to make is that it's not to say that just because there is Chinese presence, economic presence, automatically means that in terms of the weight of these investments or even the kinds of investments, the Chinese there would be an inherent preference for China. Certainly in some areas, yes, but not in all. Yeah, I hope I've answered that question.
Yeah, you did. And there may even be a sort of inverse correlation between Chinese presence and acceptance of Chinese attempted influence. The heavier the Chinese hand, or any country's hand, this is what I call the iron law of international relations, the more others will bond together to counter the hegemon or the potential hegemon. So China's position, this is one of the big takeaways of my own research and book in the region, China's presence is just pervasive, or it's perceived to be pervasive. Actually, if you scratch the surface, it's very, very uneven depending on the category: economic, military, cultural, political, diplomatic, technological. But there's a perception across Southeast Asia that is pervasive. But that makes Southeast Asians extremely uncomfortable. I would just direct viewers to the most recent annual poll by the Institute of Southeast Asian Studies at NUS, at National University of Singapore, where they poll across the region, and it comes back confirming this, that there's increased discomfort across Southeast Asia with China because of its presence and because of its heavy hand and its BRI and other things. Anyway, let me move to another question. This comes, let's see, from Mr. Intaj. It goes back to the sort of driving and norms. I think you have, Benjamin, you have all of us now, when we're out driving, we're going to be thinking differently of beyond our experiences behind the wheel. Anyway, Mr. Intaj asked, the rules of enforcement and enablement and engagement are different in different parts of the world. Some people naturally stand in a queue to get on a bus. Some do only when they are forced. And if we consider the relationship of China with other Southeast Asian countries, what will be the determining factors? This is kind of asking you to look forward out into the future. What are going to be the determining factors in the future? Political interest or similar political philosophy or economic interest? How can we differentiate the impact of China on different Southeast Asian countries and the rest looking out into the future?
Well, that's a fantastic question. I don't claim to have a very clear answer, but as I was preparing this presentation, I think right now one of the central challenge in terms of this contestation of the rules on the road is about whether these rules are sufficiently universal. There's a lot of discussion. We've also heard Chinese scholars trying to sort of put forward Chinese rules as being more universal than American rules. So that's a very fascinating development. But what we are seeing right now in terms of this whole idea of rules-based order is that what the Chinese are doing is that they are attempting to relativize Americans' claims to universalism, while at the same time accentuating the normative aspects of Chinese political preferences. So I think this is right now a game playing out not just in Southeast Asia, but certainly throughout the world. I mean, you've got the Chinese Summit of Democracies right after the American, or was it before? So really, even in terms of concepts like democracy, you had Chinese scholars coming in and sort of talking about democracies, trying to demonstrate that its view of democracy was inherently much more universal, interestingly, as compared to America. So the way I see it, and that's my response to your question, is that how China sort of frames its rules, it's going to be the crucial test of whether it is able to be a leader. If the rules are all just about enforcement, surveillance, and restrictions, like some of what we've seen, like in the COVID world in China that we're seeing right now, then it's very hard for China to convince Southeast Asia countries that it has the welfare of Southeast Asia countries in mind. However, if it's able to sort of demonstrate rules that are much more broad, generous, and expansive, while at the same time, and in this case to Southeast Asia, then I think there will be greater buy-in. And that is why right now, how China chooses to open up in a post-COVID reality, when all Southeast Asia countries, or at least most of them, are starting to open up, is going to be a very interesting case of whether China views its interests domestically as primary, or whether it views its relations with Southeast Asia as equally important.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, that's why I asked you, Benjamin, earlier about soft power, really, because soft power cannot be sui generis. It has to travel outside of borders of a country like a magnet, has to attract others to you. They want to emulate you, they accept your values, and they're willing to work with you on that normative basis. So that's the big question about China: is do their values travel? Do they have magnetic appeal so that others will buy into them? Or not? That's an open researchable question a lot of people are working on, including one of my PhD students here at GW. Speaking of GW, here's a question from Adam Bubanich of the East Asia National Resource Center here at the Sigur Center in the Elliott School. He asks, what role do diaspora groups have in the competition? I assume he means the US-China competition for influence in Southeast Asia in terms of soft power.
Well, that's a great question.
Primarily, I guess, overseas Chinese, but other diaspora groups, Indian and other.
Yeah. Well, I can only speak from the point of view as a Singaporean. I'm not familiar with Chinese diaspora group, but certainly in Southeast Asia and in my own experiences, there certainly seems to be that cultural assumption that because you're Chinese, you're a member of a Chinese diaspora, you ought to sort of automatically stand up for China's interests. And that has been something that the Chinese find it very hard to understand, that in Southeast Asia, we are in a post-colonial period. All countries are independent countries. There is no longer the idea that because you are an ethnic Chinese, therefore there is sort of greater affinity and sort of automatic affiliation with China. But that said, there exists here very strong sort of what they call clan groups and cultural groups in different countries that the Chinese have sort of co-opted, some in a much more problematic manner than others, to sort of use these groups as influences, not so much on policy per se, but certainly to sort of promote the idea that Chinese culture is peaceful. So it's not about selling China's policy on the South China Sea. I don't think most people are interested in issues like South China Sea if you ask a businessman. But the idea that Chinese culture is peaceful, it is different from the West, and therefore, whatever the Chinese state does, even if it sounds offensive, even if it sounds aggressive, it is very much for defensive purposes. So it sort of provides some kind of justification for Chinese policies because Chinese culture is peaceful, and as we Chinese, we will not act that way because it is not in our DNA. So I think that cultural element is a very strong element that needs to be further explained. Certainly, the Chinese have done a very good job, not just in Southeast Asia, but all over the world in trying to sort of sell that idea. I'm not sure whether it's considered soft power, but the idea that we are peaceful. And if we are not peaceful, it's not our fault, it's a fault of the West.
While we're on the soft power topic, here's another soft power question, a soft power softball question maybe. This comes from Jocelyn. Jocelyn asks, can China enjoy soft power in Southeast Asia if it requires nations to self-censor on issues of importance to China?
Well, it really depends on what issues. So, for instance, I mean, I don't think countries in Southeast Asia view, say, the Taiwan issue as something that is linked to soft powers. I mean, it's not even a issue per se, because no one will go out there and say, okay, I want to express support for Taiwan, but I can't because China is trying to influence me. The point of the matter is no one in Southeast Asia will express that kind of support for Taiwan. So in that respect, I would say it is not so much soft power at work. It's Chinese geopolitical sort of influence at work. I don't think it's a use of soft power in that sense for very strong political objectives. But I would say, yes, you have a point. One expression of Chinese soft power, and this goes back to what I mentioned about ASEAN, the idea of non-interference, that because it says we are not interfering in your politics, please do not sort of say things negative about us. And that's probably as far as I can go as with regards to the soft power link.
Okay, well, we're getting close to the end of our time, and we've reached the end of the questions in the chat. So I'm going to ask one last one, I guess, Benjamin, which will hopefully bring us to closure at 1:30. And that pertains to the question of hedging behavior. You mentioned early in your presentation that Southeast Asians have a long history of hedging behavior that's almost in the geopolitical DNA, I would argue, in the region. And it's quite understandable. But I guess the question would be that hedging is by definition a kind of fluid state. It's not a static state. It's constantly moving between, in this case, I suppose we're talking about the United States and China. So all 10 or 11 of these countries, 10 of whom are ASEAN members, are kind of on a spectrum moving back and forth between Washington and Beijing. I have such a spectrum, in fact, in the last chapter of my book. And I found that 7 of the 10 are on the Beijing side of the midway point.
Yeah.
That was last year. But, you know, if you do a snapshot this year or next year, it's going to be slightly different. So given the fluidity that is inherent in hedging, and the statements we frequently hear from the region, most notably from your own Prime Minister, Li Hsien-loong, don't make us choose, as the advice that Prime Minister Lee gives to the Americans. Don't force us to choose. So my question is, do you see a kind of greater or smaller, in fact, room for navigation by Southeast Asian countries between these big powers? Is there still a lot of middle space, or in fact, are the pressures from Beijing and Washington really bearing down now on Southeast Asia? How do they, in fact, have the luxury to hedge, I guess is my question.
Thank you, Professor Shambaugh. That's a great question. Allow me to use a final analogy to highlight what I mean. It's definitely not going to do with driving. I'll use the analogy of a seesaw. So assuming, and this is an assumption, that countries in the region view their interests best preserved when the seesaw is in sort of a perfect equilibrium between the United States and China and Southeast Asia countries somewhere in the middle. So assuming this is the optimum sort of state of affairs, any attempt by China or the United States to move themselves will result in the countries naturally gravitating to the other in order to maintain that equilibrium. So I would say that it really depends. I think Southeast Asia countries are aware that they have very limited space to move, as so to speak. But depending on how much China and the United States attempts to move, Southeast Asia countries will also move, maybe not in the same direction or maybe not in the same way, but they will attempt to move in a way which tries to sort of balance this seesaw again. So I think different countries will have different calculus as to what that movement entails and how much and in which direction they ought to move. I think these countries in Southeast Asia, in conclusion, are looking at what China and the United States does, and they are taking their references from these superpowers.
Great, Benjamin. I wish we had another hour to pursue these questions. But I want to thank you for a very stimulating presentation and research project and driving metaphor. Quite seriously, we need to give a lot more attention to Southeast Asia here inside the Beltway in Washington, D.C. And at the Sigur Center, we try. So having you with us for the last few months has helped catalyze that. And we want to thank you for your presence and for your research, and you're always welcome back. You've been a model visiting scholar, and I can see that there's great potential for your research to continue in this area, and hopefully for a book to be published on it. So our time has come. Thank you to the audience for joining us today. Sorry if I missed or didn't get to all the questions in the chat, but I appreciate those that we got. I think it produced a really good discussion. So thank you for attending, and have a good day and take care. Bye, everybody.
Thank you. Bye-bye.